It is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Keith Laybourn, who needs no introduction from me, I'm quite sure. He's the man with the hat. He's the man with the massive publication list. And he has several publications in the pipeline, indeed, even now, and is everywhere at once. He is also one of the most stalwart members, and indeed long-serving members of our society, having occupied practically every role available.
Wow.
Sometimes
that's you, love, not me.
in fact, as chair and secretary at one point, and now occupies a prestigious role of president. So I think we are truly delighted that he is here today to deliver the John Halstead Memorial Lecture. Now, Keith's work on the Labour movement, is extraordinarily rich, and he is going to talk to us today on the Rising Sun of Socialism, the emergence of the Labour movement in the textile district of the West Riding of Yorkshire, and no one is better qualified to talk on this topic. So, can we give him a warm welcome?
Well, first of all, one of the things that shocked me is that, of course, Jeanette has just revealed that my lecture for November the 11th is already published, which is a little bit of a worry. Let me start. Well, thank you for inviting me to give the second John Halstead lecture. I ought to say that I first met John about 1975-76, and we were involved, in a sense, in two projects. One is building up the Huddersfield History Workshop, which became the Huddersfield Local History Society. And the second thing we were involved with was with Fred Reed, who I'll come back to later on, who was at Warwick University. And he and John were going to produce a book, an edited collection of a book on the variety of socialist experiences in different areas. Now, it never came to fruition. In that group, people like Bill Lancaster went and produced his material on Leicester and the Labour movement in Leicester. I produced a variety of materials, etc., etc. And one of the things I always remember being driven by, and John always used to quote it, was E.P. Thompson did a review of the second volume of the Dictionary of Labour Biography. And he produced it in The Guardian, superb. And what did it say? It's 100 dead people, isn't it? Interred in this volume are many people who couldn't have stood each other's company for 5 seconds. All will be alike in the cemetery of print. That's not bad, is it? Now, John always used to quote that, but it's sort of a basis of really, in a sense, the way I got round to looking at the regional history, a provincial history, one might say, of the ILP. It also, when I was asked, I thought, well, what will I do? I'll do that, because otherwise I'm going to be associated with gambling all the time, because I've written a book on football pools, going to the dogs, a book on gambling. People are just going to think I'm an inveterate gambler or whatever the phrase may be. So really, in a sense, this is almost a sort of a throwback to really, in a sense, what John and I were doing in the 1970s. Let me start off then. EP, and I'll try to keep to an hour, but I'm famed, as Jeanette knows, for going on for an hour and a half. But anyway, E.P. Thompson I will try to operate this, and this was a nightmare getting this thing, I tell you. E.P. Thompson, in 1960, wrote a seminal article, really, or chapter in a book, Essays in Labour History, and it was Homage to Tom Maguire. Some of you have probably read that. And what he reminded his audience of, or his readers of, is that not everything came from London. That the growth of the Labour Party, the Independent Labour Party, the Labour Party, was very much a provincial and northern sort of development. And in that, he argued, right, he called it Tom Maguire, because Tom Maguire was an Irish poet in Leeds, wrote in various journals. I think he died about 1895, 96, but anyway, he was there and active. But what he was saying, all right, there are people here and important people here. So, but actually, the provincial growth, the growth in the textile district of the West Riding, 23 constituencies, which was a Labour hotspot. We've had that word once together already. Where the Independent Labour Party grew, where the Labour Party developed, etc. That was actually driven much more by other events, interrelationships between religious groups with old traditions, God knows what, of radicalism. And in addition to that, if there is a changing point, it's the development of community sense about the need to represent itself, and above all, the push he put forward was for the growth of the labour movement in Bradford, in the West Riding, was the Manningham Mill strike of 1890 to 91. Now, his phrase, which I always remember, is that all of this was really a product of community. It wasn't just great leaders. And what he was talking about was a community, a distinctive community, he called it, which included Bradford, Halifax, Colne Valley, etc., Huddersfield, which in the period 1890, well, it's before the ILP is formed as a national body, but 1891-92 onwards, I've got the figures, I'm not sure I've put them there, actually had, it doubled its number of local representatives, 89 in 1900 something, 180 or whatever, a few years later. And also, really, it was an area where there was tremendous success in terms of the attention that was drawn to the area by the willingness of the ILP to contest various seats. There we are, we have 23. Sorry, I'm on to the next slide now. I'm very bad with those things, but anyway. It's an area which saw the formation of the Bradford Labour Union in the wake of the Manningham Mill strike, Colne Valley Labour Union a few months later. 1892, and I go through some of this material later on, it saw the emergence from the Trades Council forming the ILP or the Bradford Halifax Labour Union, etc. But it was also an area which saw a coming together of these influences in terms of the formation of the National Independent Labour Party. It was formed 1314 to the 16th. If you actually take it out, it's 13 to the 16th. Some say 1314, some 15, 16. But in fact, the ILP, the National ILP, which is the intellectual godparent of the Labour Party, was formed in Bradford by the chair of it was William Henry Drew. I'll show you a picture of him shortly. And he was the chair of the actual meeting. You'll find it was in the wake of the Manningham Mill strike 2 years later, but it's bringing together lots of bodies that are formed at that time. Fabian societies, labour unions, and a lot of representatives from the West Riding of Yorkshire. And perhaps I ought to, one of the difficulties of these sort of things is going on, but can I just, I've indicated some of the municipal success there, but I'll come back. Here we have where it was formed in 1890, where it held some of its basic business meetings in 1893. The other meeting place was St George's Hall, if anybody knows it, in Bradford. This is interesting because in Bradford they've actually put a little sign on the building that says, "This is where the ILP was born." It's the wrong building, which is I've gone round. It's not that, but it's not that. That's an old Wesleyan church and things which changed around, but I know they've got new facades, but it's there. It's near the street. It's near the road, so you can see it. So the ILP was formed largely in this area because of the success of these groups, which I'm going to talk about later on. If I can go to the next slide, get myself confused here. This is, I'm sorry about the pictures. I've got my better ones in the coal at home, but anyway, because I can't get to them. But who attended? Apart from the obvious people like Ben Tillett, who we'll come back to, Joseph Burgess at the top, who called the meeting that led to the formation of a national ILP in Bradford, etc. There's a chap here, you don't quite get the name, Alan G, active in Huddersfield and active in the workers, in the Yorkshire Factory Textile paper. I'm a journalist of it, and he worked at Mills in Huddersfield. You've got Alp Mattison there, an engineer from Leeds. You've got, I'm trying to think, there's, the one person don't allow me to forget him, is Edwin Holford, because, you know, he was a leading figure in the Fabian movement that emerged at that time. Edwin Holford, if anybody's from Bradford, they know E.R. Holford was the baker's. He was a baker, sometimes master baker, sometimes he was a journeyman baker. But they also employed, at various times, he became a leading figure in the Fabian movement in Bradford. And he's also employed a chap called George Minty, who was a vanman. The Holfords had it always. And, you know, he became a councillor in Minty, and he used to go with his van, because he was a roundsman. And he used to leave it outside the town hall, much to the disgust of the Liberal councillors, who didn't like that sort of thing. So, you know, we have, amongst the greats, so because obviously Edward Bernstein and so forth there. So it was becoming a prominent area. And this very quickly is the first National Council of the ILP, which didn't actually have Keir Hardie on it. But at the top, there's two figures that disappear there, but there's a chappie there. That's John Lister, who brought in to the movement money, amongst other things. He was the owner of Shibden Hall in Halifax, 3,000 acres estate, and I'll tell a little bit about more later on. There's Catherine St John Conway there as well, but who was active in the Yorkshire area quite significantly. And we got here, just because I'm going to talk a little bit about him, well, obviously you know James Keir Hardie is, but W.H. Drew, who led the Manningham Bill strike, the first national ILP, etc. He chaired it. Now, I'm not sure if one thing I should have mentioned, even before the National ILP was formed, some of the Labour Union was so powerful in Bradford that it brought in Ben Tillett to stand in a Bradford West by-election in 1892. Now, Tillett's interesting because, first of all, he wouldn't stand unless there were 1,000 signatures. So I got 2,000 signatures from people in Bradford West who would support him. And secondly, apart from that, the petition to establish who was supporting him, it still survives. I found it in Bradford Archives 40 years ago, and I got a school to analyse it. And where you can get people, because it gives you the names and the addresses, and where you can actually get people who you identify, you'll find one thing that's relevant to what I'm saying later on, is trade unionists. The prominent people are the trade unionists, and you can follow them through and there. Now, I think that might be the end of my pictures before I go back, yes, because I haven't started the lecture yet. But can I just say, you know, one of the things that is important about the area is the way it attracted enormous numbers of leading figures in the socialist movement. I've probably not put them all down there, but I've listed some of the successors. Just think of some of the contenders. Ben Tillett stood in 1892 and then in 1895 in Bradford West against a man who I want you to remember, Alfred Illingworth. Illingworth was the big boss, second largest employer, God knows what, in Bradford. And Illingworthism is one of the reasons why people moved over to the Labour Party. But I'll explain that later on. You've got John Lister, landowner, Anne Lister, John Lister, son was John Lister. So you've all seen the series. John Lister, Halifax 1893 to 95, and became the first treasurer of the ILP. Tom Mann stood in Combe Valley in 1895, and in Halifax in 1897. Keir Hardie, and I'll come back to that. James Keir Hardie stood for Bradford in Bradford East in 1896, in November 1896. And then you've got people like James Parker. And by 1906, although there were 23 seats, normally 19 Liberal and 4 Conservatives, Labour in 1906 won 3 seats in that election. The most important, from my point of view, was Fred Jowett in Bradford. But of course, James Parker won one of the 2 seats in Halifax, and James Parker was only narrowly defeated by Keir Hardie to be leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party. So, he was an important figure. James O'Grady in Leeds East. And just remember, a year later, there's a by-election in Colne Valley, and Victor Grayson becomes the MP for Colne Valley, only for 3 years, but, the impact is occurring. And remember also that you've got, I've put it down very quickly, this is an area of tremendous publicity. Oh, you've got the Clarion, you've got the Labour leader, the national papers, but you've also got Demos, produced in 1888-9 by James Barclay. You've got, what else have you got? You've got the Labour Echo, you've got Forward, you've got the Bradford Pioneer towards the end of our period, which of course is edited at one stage by Frank Betts, who was the father of who? Barbara Betts, Barbara Castle, and so forth. Now these are active. I mean, this is an area of Vic Feather and so forth. These are the groups that come in. And so it's not surprising that in 1893, we have a national ILP is formed. But in 1914, at the 21st conference, in this particular case, the person who was mainly active in the conference organising that was J.H. Palin. I don't know if you've come across Palin. He was active in Bradford and MP for Newcastle later on, but he was also the man who was president of the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants at the time of Taff Vale. So, we have a big impact. And one of the things I would say is that not only in parliamentary terms, this area grew rapidly in terms of municipal activities. In 1913, Labour in Bradford had 43% of the municipal vote, compared to the 28% of the Liberals and the Conservatives each. So really, in a sense, this is sort of a sort of starting point to reflect that, in fact, it was successful, a successful organisation. Let's just very quickly, what I'd like to just do very quickly is just to indicate where this research fits into the debates about the rise of Labour. Some of you will know this fairly well anyway. You know that there's been 3 developments. One, many years ago, which I was associated with, was class politics. Why did the Labour Party emerge? Because of the rise of the class politics, the link. And this is sort of argued by George Dangerfield from his lair in California in 1934, the strange death of liberal England, where he actually says, after 1906, when Labour's got 29 MPs, the Liberal Party no longer the party of the left. Henry Pelling in his various works, Ross McKibben more recently, in the 1970s anyway, linking the emergence of working class commitment to the trade union movement, the expansion of the trade union movement, very much with the growth of class politics. And I've been partly associated with it. I've got to say Matthew Worley more recently has just hinted that this sort of theme is developing. There is structures and developments beforehand. But more recently, of course, the challenging that was Trevor Wilson's the decline of the Liberal Party, and indeed P.F. Clarke. And what they're arguing is the Liberal Party was healthy at the beginning of the First World War, but the reason for the success of Labour is the vacuum created by the destruction of liberal values, and the fact that in the there's a split in the Liberal Party, its values have been challenged, its peace, retrenchment, free trade have been challenged by war, and so forth. And of course, there's that ringing phrase by Trevor Wilson that the Liberal Party was then run down by the rampant omnibus of war. But more recently, and I've got to say, I've been linked with the first area, and that's fair enough, because I do believe that trade unions, there is a movement in that direction. But, anyway, it doesn't matter. But really, in a sense, from my early days, I was involved really very much in the third development, and that is that it varies from area to area. What shapes the Labour Party and the emergence of the Labour movement is that I think there's class politics developing, trade union connection, and that's vital, but it varies at different paces. And what I think the person who really started that thinking in that direction was Bill Lancaster, who wrote on Leicester. And if you look at his Leicester material, what he talks about in the case of Leicester is that it's really NUPSO, the National Union of Boot and Shoot Operatives, that's behind it, although there's Leicester's an unusual place. It's a two-seat constituency, so you give opportunities for Labour alliances. So he started that off, really, I think. And then on top of that, you've got Duncan Tanner, well, David Howell, who wrote his ILP book, which was about the regional variations, more trade unionism here, different factors here, etc., operating upon a base of gradual move towards the trade union working class association with the ILP and the Labour Party. And Duncan Tanner, even though he said a lot of elections in the Edwardian period are sort of fights, individual fights, rather than the class consciousness fights, I think moves in that direction. And more recently, and I've got to say this, we've got Martin Pugh in his book Speak for Britain. And in Speak for Britain, he seems to discover everything that people have been saying for 40 years. What does he say? There's a regional, the Labour Party is based upon regional variations. It's not, you know, I've got a book in there called The Rising Sun of Socialism. I edited a book called the Centennial History of the ILP, too heavy to bring today. And it's got articles which argue that particular point. Let me just suggest, because I can never find anything here, but Bill Perdue, here we are, in that collection, Jeff Hill talks about Lancashire. It's a different type of story, but there's a trade union alliance between conservative and liberal trade unions who come into the Labour Party from 1909 onwards. And there's also socialist unity. Nothing relevant to that in Bradford. The idea of socialist groups, the SDF and the Socialist League, organising together for the activities they were involved in. And he rightly points out half the ILPs, or just half the ILPs returned in 1906, were actually returned for Lancashire. But then you got John Belsham, he's written on Liverpool. And yes, there is that sort of class element, but there's a problem in Liverpool of arrested development. They move at different paces. In the Black Country, I know it's not until the late 20s, because there's this element of concern, that the Labour Party makes its major breakthrough. Bill Perdue, if anybody remembers him, wrote about the North East, and he talks about the way in which, it's arrested development in some respects, because the miners are very much liberal until suddenly in 1999 they've become, Labour. So it's an arrested development. Leicester I mentioned with, but I just had the other day, I had to look at an article on Peterborough, if I remember correctly. And that was all about arrested development, wasn't it? Although Labour did break through in Peterborough. So, there's a lot of stuff on regional history that I think has already been established. So what's my view before I start? And that is to argue that really, in a sense, the Labour movement, I think, emerges because of the undercurrent of rising trade unionism and the class association with it. And I'll come back to that. But also, it's very regional. It'll vary according to what factors in the region, what factors divide unions, it's these sorts of factors that shape it. So it's, so I've got to say I resent some of the comments. Laybourn is a class, believes in the class. They haven't read the bloody books. They have not read, they have not realised there are produced books on regional ILP growth of that. So you can see what my position is straight away there. Now, what I want to do when I start this is to actually look at the West Yorkshire Labour movement and why it was so successful and why it became a hotspot. Is it socialist activities? Is it labourism? Is it trade unionism? Is it middle class liberal? There's all sorts of factors one needs to look at which create the mixture. And really, in a sense, West Yorkshire, as I've said already, established its reputation very quickly. In West Yorkshire, the textile district, the Bradford Union, Labour Union, formed in May 1891 in Firth's Temperance Hall, which still exists as a bit of a shell of a building. Very quickly, had 2,000 members and 19 clubs. Halifax 800 members and 5 clubs, later 6 clubs. Huddersfield, 6 clubs and later 5, and about 700 members. Colne Valley, 700 members down to 250 and then back to about, 700 or 800. These are very active groups. And I could go through, there was for Keith Laybourn, Leeds, etc. And it had the success that I mentioned. But what I want to look at is a number of factors. I've dismissed, as you'll appreciate, the idea of socialist unity, which might have happened in Lancashire. It certainly didn't happen in Yorkshire. But let me start off, if I can remember to keep moving this, here we are. The first area really is the Chartist, secularist and radical influence. There's often been an argument, I don't want to tread on your toes, but that Chartism was the basis of the sort of radicalism of ILPism and Labourism, the growth of the Labour Party in the late 1890s, early 20th century. That's often been said. But Edward Thompson, in his homage to Tom Maguire, pointed out that when referring to a gathering of Halifax Chartist veterans in 1885 in a temperance hall with George Webber, the old physical force Chartist, that man toasted Mr. Gladstone for his reforms. Ben Wilson in Halifax, in The Struggles of an Old Chartist, suggested, page 40 of his book, the majority of those attending the meeting, this meeting of Chartists, have become men of business and in some cases employers of labour. Let me think of Bradford. There's a very famous Leicester socialist called Thomas Cooper, who came to Bradford and lived in Bradford in about 1888 to about 1890, just before he died. And he was approached by a chap called Fred Pickles, one of the early stalwarts of the Labour movement in Bradford. And the records actually are on the People's History Museum in Manchester. He goes there. He says, I showed Cooper my plans. What does Cooper say? Young man, you should find something worthwhile in life rather than waste your life on impractical schemes. You know, he again had changed in that respect. And indeed, you could go through a number of others. Connected with this, obviously, is the movement of secularism in Bradford. The famous J.W. Gott, republicanism and secularism. J.W. Gott helped to form the British Socialist League and became an editor of Truth Seeker. He paraded in Bradford, but he only had one person I could trace, a chap called Gaisley, who actually was active in the ILP. Secularism was limited anyway. James Bartley was on the verge of that. Now, James Bartley was from Newry, a typographer, active in the early Labour movement. He was on that and produced Demos, which was sort of moving in that direction. But I think Charles Leonard Robinson, now these names may not mean anything to you, but Charles Leonard Robinson, ILP, Labour, first Labour mayor of Bradford, except he never made it. He died between his election as mayor and starting off as mayor. And he in 1872 said, recalling his life later on, in 1872, however, there was not much socialism in Bradford. I remember a few young forward spirits who met occasionally in the informal way in the Black Bull, a pub I used to know well in the 1960s, an old hostelry situated close to the top of Ivegate in Bradford. One of their number was the disciple of Louis Blanc, who lectured in Bradford in 1860. This gentleman made a proposal that a socialist society should be formed, but nothing came of it. This was the first suggestion to organise socialism in Bradford that I have knowledge of. Now that really takes me on, really to say, well, really in a sense, it's not Chartism or secularism, but I think the sort of starting point for socialism in Bradford, and indeed the West Riding of Yorkshire, was the arrival or the lecture given by William Morris, who came to Bradford in who came to Bradford in February 1884 on the behalf of the quasi-Marxist Socialist Democratic Federation. And this is just before, at the end of the year, remember, he formed the Socialist League because he wanted the link with trade unionism. And he said here, and he had the odd atmosphere that you get here. I mean, I've had it once. I went to Bradford, Wakefield Trades Council. In the middle of your lecture, people are ordering pints of Sam Smiths. It's not good for you. And this is exactly what happened with him, the pie and pea culture. And he said this: the Bradford lecture went off very well, a full house and all that, but there are set of Philistines there. And it will be a long time before we do anything with them. You see, the workmen are pretty comfortable there because all the spinning and the weaving is done by women and children. The latter go to the mill at 10 years of age for 5 hours a day as half-timers. I don't think all my vigorous words, of a nature of which you will and may well imagine, shook the conviction of my entertainers that this was the way to make an earthly paradise. Well, he was wrong, because in his audience were some of the people who became leading socialist and ILPers in Bradford. Fred Jowett, who became an MP for Bradford, was there. You've got Halstead and others I've mentioned. You've got Tom Paler. You've got J.L. Mann. And these people go off. And apart from finding the Socialists, they get active in the development of the new unionist movement of the late 80s and early 90s. You know, involved in gas workers in Leeds and they help out in the Taylor-Esser strike, etc. So he was wrong. And what they did was to form together, out of this, two groups in Leeds and Bradford came together, and I'll come back to these right at the end. It's not terribly good on there, and I've got a better picture elsewhere. But the only person that's really important to me is second line in, Fred Jowett. But there were about a dozen of each, and they formed the Socialist League, and this is the basis. You know, their activities are involved in new unionism. Most of them are skilled men, but become active in new unionism, etc. So really, in a sense, Alf Mattison's there, I mentioned earlier on, and others who support it. And they're active in creating the basic radical socialist groupings in Bradford. Now, that's fine, but that's not sufficient enough, to have a group of socialists. You might as well hang stuff on the Trotskyists at the present time. You can have a group of factions, they're all divided into factions, there's all sorts of problems, but you need a little bit more than that. And one thing I'd like to move on to is, and it's often forgotten, is religious influence. Now, in a sense, we think about religion, we think about the salvation of soul, rather than the creation of the kingdom of heaven upon earth. But really, in a sense, I think religion was very important in this area. And there's two opinions on it, really. One is by Tony Jowett, who some of you may have come across. He argues that nonconformity, and particularly congregationalism, drives the labour movement in the textile district. Most of the leading figures are congregationalists. We'll see that later on. But then he's opposed by Leonard Smith, who was one of my, I'll put him down there, Len Smith, who was a Congregationalist. In later life, he became in charge of the Congregational Department or institution at Manchester University. And he argues that, yes, around these people there was influence, but beyond it, there wasn't. So it's depending upon small groups of influence. I tend to be more in favour of what Tony Jowett says. Let me start off. I might not follow it in quite that batting order, but in the 1880s, 1885, the Reverend D.K. Anderson, a new pastor at Horton Lane Congregational Church, came to Bradford. He lasted 8 years before he was kicked out. Now, Horton Lane is where Titus Salt, the big billionaires of Bradford, used to go. By the time he's there, 8 of his congregation are millionaires. And people like Fred Jowett went to that, so there's working men as well. Now, what he started preaching, and this is just one phrase, he became concerned about the social conditions of Bradford and the area. And he said, the socialist indictment against modern society is a true bill. We cannot answer the charge. Now, he was eventually sort of kicked out in 1893, but he was taken over, replaced by Reverend T. Rhonda Williams, Now, T. Rhondda Williams was a friend of R.J. Campbell, the New Theology, the here and now sort of approach to religion. And he set up a society called the League of Progressive Religion and Social Thought. And he maintained that the truth is that any minister who refuses the advocacy of social reform and confines himself to work of the individual salvation is shirking the crucial problem of modern life, which is basically to deal with the social problems of society. Now, most important of all for him is that, in fact, he formed a body called the Social Reform Union. This is 100 people, religious figures, or people, mainly religious figures. Most of them are Congregationalists. There's Dr. Reverend Caragod Jones is Unitarian. There's Arthur Priestman, I want you to remember, who was the third richest man in Bradford. He's a Quaker. And what they do, they formed in 1893. And they join with the ILP, the Trades Council, and the Fabian Society. And I've forgotten the Fabians, haven't I? I said I would forget them. And the Fabian Society in form of the Social Reform Union. And basically what happens is that in 1894, they conduct, with these various organisations, they conduct a survey of unemployment in Bradford, the appalling situation. And they have, and it still survives, a report on every ward in Bradford, how many people are unemployed for, totally unemployed or partly unemployed. It's one of the best documents I've ever seen. And it's superb there. And so, these people are involved in that sort of activity. If you just might allow me 1 second, I'll go back to what I should have said about Fabianism. There was Fabianism in Halifax, and the Fabian Society in Bradford. And one of the socialist things I should have mentioned, because the formation of this Fabian Society, because it was formed by the Reverend Brian Dale, who appears here somewhere. Have I put him on? No, probably not. The Reverend Brian Dale, a Congregationalist, and also by John Lister, who went in 1891 to Teal's bookshop in Bradford, in Halifax, bought a copy of that exhilarating work by Karl Marx called Das Kapital, and immediately formed the Fabian Party and Fabian Society, and brought in George Bernard Shaw, the Halifax Guardian. They have brought this Kid Glove Revolutionary, forget the phrases out, Kid Glove Revolutionary, to disturb a peaceful community of Halifax. Anyway, there is a link with religion, but I'll come back to this. It's not just the nonconformists, it's the Church of England as well. Reverend Bree Graham was active in Bradford, went to Colne Valley, was one of the 30 ministers who helped Victor Grayson to win Colne Valley in 1907. And W.B. Graham was, eventually left that area, went to land farming in the north of England. But, he was there. But I've also attached to this the House of the Resurrection at Murfield. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Father Bull, Huddleston later on was there, wasn't he, many years later. Father Bull was in charge there. In 1906, Labour won 29 seats in the general election. Well, the ILP won 29 seats, I should say. The result was a petition produced by Father Bull of 200 clerics, Nonconformist Church of England, but mainly Nonconformist, mainly Church of England, who signed a petition congratulating the Labour Party on its breakthrough. So there's a lot of sort of support of that. And can I mention the other point? I mean, people like Schwann and others I've mentioned, but a lot of the early leaders of the Labour movement, Fred Jowett, Congregation, D.B. Foster of Leeds, these were people who were religious in their tone, and they associated their religion with being returned to the municipality. And Jowett wrote on the Socialists in the City. He says, he argued that the future must grow from the present, and the purpose will be to bring municipal institutions into harmony with social gospel, which he preaches in accordance to his conviction. And D.B. Forster of Leeds likened his conversion to socialism that of Bunyan's City of God. Elected to Leeds Council, he said, the town hall became the house of God. The city became to me the household of God. Slight change there. And really, in a sense, you've got that sort of very strong link there, which, despite the fact that the Labour Church movement emerged to challenge the socialist, to challenge the nonconformist groups, it was an important aspect of that linkage with Labour. Can I move on to the next one? Actually, rather than doing that, the next one probably is better. Because it does what I say. One of the things that, again, Martin Pugh says in his Speak for Britain is there are rich men in the Labour Party who financed it and whatever and kept its activities flowing. Again, that's not new. I discovered this in the archives in Halifax in 1971 or 72. And what it is was a declaration. It's the Halifax Joint Stock Company, Lister and Brocklehurst, getting the people below to finance the Labour Party or the ILP if it gets into financial trouble. We were promised to pay the debts, basically. And the 1895 election, if anybody knows anything about it, for the ILP was disastrous. They put a lot of candidates forward. They all got defeated. Even Keir Hardie lost his seat at West South. One person suggested it was the most costly funeral since that of Napoleon. So, which I think is rather. But these people are writing it. You might just be able to see at the top John Lister of Shibden Hall, Halifax. Now, John Lister owned 3,000 acres. He'd been to Oxford, where he was influenced by William Morris. Heard the lectures of William Morris, was an environmentalist. Started off as Church of England, became Catholic, etc., etc. But he was, and I've already shown the picture of him, he was at the ILP conference in 1893. He stood for the ILP in 1893 in Halifax, the general election. And he financed the Labour Party. He provided about £1,000. And every year he wrote off £100 to £200 off. So they never had to pay him back. And of course, that's, it's important. And he didn't resent that. Next one is Benson from Manchester, became second treasurer of the ILP. The third, you can't quite see it, Franz Littlewood, Rove House. He was a wealthy woolen merchant and whatever. And he objected actually to the Liberal Party bringing in Liberals without real proper consultation, just on as candidates for Clerkenwell Valley. Now he financed the party as well. And then we come back to Arthur Priestman. I asked you to remember his name. Arthur Priestman. Arthur Priestman was a Quaker, ran the third largest business in Bradford, textile business. And he was his brother, and he ran the business. They were And H.B. Priestman, his brother, in 1900 became leader of the Liberal Party in Bradford. In 1906, when Fred Jowett was returned to Parliament, Arthur Priestman became the Labour leader in Bradford. So it's interesting, you've got the Labour leaders and the Liberal leader running a business together, how that worked. There was an attempt later on when he died in 1918 to explain how it was that he supported Labour and became a councillor and everything else. And the argument was that he was concerned with poverty. He'd been drawn into for instance, he'd been drawn into the Social Reform Union, etc. So it was that sort of situation. So wealthy men cannot be ignored. And I always think back to what James K. Hardie said. Wealthy men like Lister provided the basis. And when you came to Halifax, you stayed at Shibden Hall, And I always like that comment that was made. And K. Hardie makes it. He says that all the gangrel elements of the Labour movement descended upon Shibden Hall. much to the disgust of the butler, which I think is rather nice. Sort of sums it up, really. So we've got that. The fourth factor, and I hope I'm keeping up to, sorry, I should show there, obviously, John Lister outside Shibden Hall, and that's Alf Mattison, who was an engineer from Leeds, and Mattison, Lister, and Edward Carpenter from Sheffield, regularly for about 3 or 4 years went off to Venice for their holidays. So it was a sort of close association there. But Lister, was there when he got fed up with the Labour Party, became an antiquarian. If you want all the details of the Peasants' Revolt, they're in Halifax archives because he wrote them all out. But to the British, the British Museum. He went to transcribe all these records. What I would like to move on to very quickly is the cultural and social factors. Many years ago, James Hinton argued that, in fact, cultural factors were not important in the growth of the Labour movement. Very quickly, Fred Reid, challenged him on this and wrote extensively. If anybody knows Fred, some of you must know Fred, wrote about the socialist societies, the Labour churches, and other groups that emerged. And basically, he said, well, that's not the case. And then, really, in a sense, Stephen Yeo raised that in his articles in 1977, I think it was, The Religion of Socialism, where he said, cultural factors, social factors were important between 1883 and 1896, because he associated a lot of that with William Morris. And that's I was there in 1981 when I was on the same platform as him in the Bradford Library, which was the intellectual centre of Bradford, and he was basically addressing an audience of academics plus ILPers, ex-ILPers, and defending his position. He was influenced by James K. Hardy, who in 1898 said, actually, we've got to move from cultural activists to winning elections. And I think what Stephen Yeo really took seriously is that, that cultural aspect of the movement declined. I think it was wrong. And two ILPers who loved him were shouting for him and the things he said, because he talked their language. And if you've ever heard Stephen Yeo, he can talk a language that's different from you. Academics didn't understand him necessarily, but there are 2 or 3 ILPs saying, "Great, you're right. Most things you're right, lad." And what really, in a sense, but going back to this, I think it was wrong on that aspect. That he also based his views upon the Labour churches. There were ones in Bradford, Leeds, Halifax, Keighley, etc. And the Labour churches were, John Trevor set up the Labour church movement. And they could be very mixed. They could be very religious. You could go to Bradford and you had to lead them in prayer. But you could go to other areas and it was not so. But the important point about the Labour church, for at least a decade anyway, it was the lecture. He used to have a lecture on Sunday morning. You brought all the great names in. You brought Tom Manning to talk about French syndicalism, if I remember correctly. It's that sort of thing. So you brought that sort of climate of interest. But they did decline, and Bradford and Leeds joined about 1900. But there were socialist Sunday school movements. To dismiss them is totally wrong, because the socialist Sunday school movements, often linked with the Labour Church, but they weren't actually linked, started in Glasgow and near London, and developed very much as ways in which you could educate children to the ways of socialism. You'd read from J.D. Gould, I think from Leicester. You'd read his lessons and so forth. You'd obviously be taught on the Socialist 10 Commandments. I couldn't get that on. You don't believe the problems I had getting that sort of system going. But the Socialist Commandments, and if you've ever seen them, there are 10, but the 4th one is always the one that's considered the most important. Honour good men, be courteous to all men, bow down to none. There was an educational aspect, there was a social aspect, it brought families together. And the next picture, the next picture is really of This is the Wick Treaty in 1919 of the East Bowling Socialist Sunday School. Bradford had 6, Halifax had 5, Combe Valley had 3 or 4, and then it declined. I once had an argument with David Clark, who was MP for Combe Valley at that time, Lord Clark now, and he said socialism in Combe Valley is all to do with socialist Sunday schools and whatever. I said, no, you might say that. There weren't many trade unionists, but everybody, just about everybody you can mention who could be a trade unionist was a trade unionist and active in the movement. So we had sort of disagreements about that. But it was, an influential movement. And, you've got ILP clubs, which I won't really have time to talk about. I've only about half an hour to go on there. I'm all right. And so forth. So really, in the sense, there was a strong, healthy cultural movement. I'm always reminded on Socialist Sunday Schools by Vic Feather. It was one of these on one of these question times. You all remember Vic Feather? Vic Feather, the General Secretary of the TUC. There was a question time. And they asked, what was your greatest educational impact, or what, in education? Vic Feather said, Socialist Sunday Schools. Because he went to West Bowling, which expired. His brother, Fergal, is it Fergal? Fergal or Fergal, went to East Bowling. And they were, educated, inculcated with socialist values. And he himself, of course, had been you can almost date his birth, can't you? Because he was called Victor Grayson Feather. So 1907 is the sort of starting point there. Remember also, I'll miss a lot out here, but can I just say also, let us not forget the Claran Movement, which I've got material on there. The Claran Movement was, sorry, I've got the wrong one. Wait a minute. I'm looking at one. I hope I've got it this time, yeah. Anyway, this was formed by Robert Blatchford, but it was powerful in Manchester, but it was powerful in Yorkshire. Montague Blatchford, his brother, built up the movement in Halifax. His influence, I mean, he helped create Clarion Cyclists, Clarion Scouts, Clarion bands and jazz band, all sorts of things. And the same is there in Combe Valley. And the same is there to a large extent, I think, in Bradford as well. And looking at that picture, I got that, the original, it's been reproduced elsewhere, from the daughter, you might not be able to see it, that's a chap called E.R. Hartley, who ran the Clarion Van movement. And as it says, read the Clarion, Socialism, the Hope of the World. And his daughter, Gertrude, who also ran it with him, is there, but you can't see it, but in her arms is a baby. I interviewed the baby in the 1970s. I interviewed her daughter and indeed her granddaughter. And I got quite a lot of material from them. And, she told me about the sort of variety of activities they were involved in, etc. I got in trouble with Fred Reed once because I showed him this. And I said, E.R. Hartley. He said, the butcher. I said, yes, who gave renderings. Didn't go down well. But he did go around singing, Clarion singing groups and things. And there are Clarion cyclist groups in Keighley and other areas which are active. I was reminded of Philip Snowden, and he wrote in his autobiography, that in fact, that he recalled the cycling and propaganda trips which cyclists would stop off near fields and attach to the backside of cows posters proclaiming socialism, the hope of the world. Beautiful. But he was right, that's what they did. They went out to the countryside and set up their boxes and preached. So the Clarion movement, I think, was very powerful in this area. Now, it really sort of takes me on to the two main factors, I think, that bring these together. You've got a socialist group, you've got religious groups, etc., but you do need mass support. And I think the two things, and they could be taken together really, are anti-liberalism and trade unionism in the West Riding of Yorkshire and area. The first point I want you to remember, and I've mentioned him already once, is that a lot of the opposition, I mean, the dominant person perhaps in this area, politically as well as almost industrially, was Alfred Illingworth. He ran a big business. In later years, it became Illingworth Morris in the 1950s, but it was a big business. And he opposed all independent working class action. He supported child labour. He opposed trade unions. And he felt that, I think, he described the emergence of the ILP in Bradford as one of those little breezes that occasionally runs across Bradford. Not quite right. But in addition to that, I mean, you know, he really would try to stop any initiative. He didn't like working men taking time off work to go to councils. There were all sorts of things. And he's the money bags of Bradford, but he's also the money bags of Yorkshire liberalism, or textile area liberalism. So I want you to remember him. And really, in a sense, remember that a lot of the actions reflect his attitudes. It's quite clear, for instance, in the 1880s, that the Bradford Trades Council is emerging. It's got 3,500 members. A few years later, it's got 13,500. But anyway, and its leading figure is a chap called Samuel Shafto. He was a liberal. He organises the Liberal Electoral Association, etc., etc. Trade Council, so we'll put him forward for a seat. He's kicked back. Tries in 1888 again, put forward for a seat. He's kicked back. And what do the Liberals do? They appoint Martin Field, who was a typographer who did not employ trade unionists. Now there's an insult straight away. And there was a tremendous uproar about that. Shafto had described himself as the most kicked about football in Bradford politics. Elsewhere, I've mentioned him already earlier on, Franz Littlewood, at the inaugural meeting of the ILP in 1893. A small merchant, treasurer of the ILP after John Lister. He complains fundamentally about the corruption of the Liberal 200, I think it was 200 in Cornwall, but it might have been 400. I think it's 400 in Halifax, 200 in Cornwall Valley. In what they did is basically Sir James Kitson helped the Liberals to put forward a candidate, I think in 1892. It's a bit complex, but people like Herbert Glaston are involved, etc. And what's happening is Sir James Kitson, without any discussions, and Littlewood is a member of the Liberal 200, actually bring in Sir James Kitson from Leeds as a sort of kickback, a payback for some of the events that have earlier on. He says that's wrong. There should be some democracy within the Liberal Party. And then I've got this sort of example of what happens to great advocates of Labour representation. William Pollard Biles. Now, William Pollard Biles was owner and editor at various times of the, I haven't put it down there, the Bradford Observer. Sorry, I've put it down there. Now, the Bradford Observer is actually a sort of middle row to left-wing Liberal paper. The Bradford Daily Telegraph, which a lot of people think is it's honestly conservative, is actually a Liberal paper run by Illingworth and friends. And what happens is that Pollard Biles, he stands up for the workers in the Manningham Mill strike of 1890-91. He gets shares and challenges Samuel Cunliffe Lister. He also, in addition, he gets the Shipley Trades Council to support him, to force the Liberals to put him forward as the Liberal candidate for Shipley, 1892. But the Liberal bosses and Saltaire bosses all move against him in 1895 to get him out. He stands, and we'll see it later on. He puts forward his name for the East Bradford by-election in 1896 as a compromise candidate, but he's ignored. Eventually in 1903, he decides to go off to Manchester wins the seat there and gets to Parliament. This is the Bradford Daily Telegraph. Not a Conservative paper, but a right-wing Liberal paper run by Alfred Illingworth. And what it says here, he has affluence, he has leisure, and he has ambition. That other desideratum, troops of friends, is denied him. Or at least if he has troops, his enemies are in battalions. Owing to untoward circumstances, Mr. Byles's career was so circumscribed here in Bradford that it became intolerable. To find greater space and ampler air, he has had at the age of 64 to expatriate himself, to leave all his friends and associations behind him, to live in Manchester. It's a hard fate, but it is necessary for Mr. Byles should fulfil the political role to which he is irresistibly drawn. Then the abuse starts. You couldn't be in his room with him for 5 minutes without disagreeing with him, or blame Dame Nature on his failures to deal with his fellow Liberals, etc. And you always have the final insult. Of course, his wife is very agreeable. So really, they sort of kick him out. But the biggest, that raised a lot of antipathy towards liberalism, the way in which they treated representatives of Labour. But the biggest changeover, and I think it's the most important of the issue of anti-liberalism, is in 1896, James K. Hardy stands for the East, Bradford East, gets 953 votes and says socialism will appear in 1953. But if you look at the context of it, first of all, the Liberals have been challenged by Labour. In 1895, Ben Tillett standing for Bradford West. And Ben Tillett, takes a lot of votes away, but Illingworth, who is his opponent, just gets in, scrapes in. But the Liberals thought they would win all 3 seats. Their opponents, and the 3 Conservative opponents, were, here we are, Ernest Flower, Byron Reid, and the Marquis of Lorne. You can imagine what the Liberals wrote. They're a broken reed, a wilting flower, and a Marquis of Lorne. That was the sort of thing. But the trouble is, the Liberals went to the bottom of the deep blue sea. They lost, not the Liberals. So they blamed the Labour Party or ILP group vehemently for that. Well, in 1896, Byron Reid died. And therefore, there was a question of who would replace Byron Reid. And of course, the Conservatives had their man in mind, but the Liberals couldn't find a candidate to begin with, until eventually Alfred Illingworth found a Liberal candidate from the other side of the Pennines called Alfred Bilson. And there's Clarion, there's a beautiful cartoon in the Clarion. Clarion didn't have many cartoons at that time, there's one here, which depicted Bilson being dragged from Forster Street station, railway station, by the scruff of his neck to the election. And of course, Bilson wins it. But the Clarion at the time commented, the 2 most important events of the week are the discovery of a sea-served Duff Lowestoft and the discovery of a Liberal candidate for Bradford. They are both said to be remarkably fine specimens, the serpent being quite 300 yards or feet long and as big round as an elephant. The Liberal candidate was not so large as round as that, though quite big enough for the emergency. He was landed also after some trouble, whereas the other curiosity escaped. Beautiful. And in the wake of that, at the defeat of Keir Hardie, we said, not far off, was it? Socialism will arrive in Britain in 1953. I got 1953 votes, so but in the wake of it, the Daily Chronicle wrote this. Liberalism in Bradford has been doomed to failure because for years it took no account of Labour. The people of Bradford were expected to return to Parliament and to take their political orders from them. Illingworthism is a gospel without sympathy, comradeship or hope for the Bradford worker, and an attempt to identify it with liberalism has its consequence in Keir Hardieism. A beautiful comment there. Now, if I can link that to some extent with trade unionism, remember what I've said already, 1 or 2 hints already. If you look at the, sorry, I better move on. Oh, sorry, one thing I should have said as the importance of this election. It was really built up as the great return of Hardy. And you can see who supports him at St George's Hall in Bradford. You've got, obviously, Tom Mann, top of the list there. Robinson's a Bradford man. Ayerhurst is Bradford. Councillor Arthur Priestman, who I mentioned, the rich Priestman. Catherine St John Conway, or Fred Brocklehurst, obviously, Reverend Roberts, who was, I mentioned him, a Congregationist. And then, little known at that time, J.R. MacDonald, Paul Bland, who was connected with the Fabians. I forgot there, George Minty at the top. E.R. Hartley, you've already seen. Pete Curran, Russell, John Lister, Margaret Macmillan, of course. So it was made into a big meeting. It was a big thing. And that defeat had reverberations. But let me move on to the last sort of area. And that's really, in a sense, I'm endorsing, really, in a sense, what E.P. Thompson said. That, in the 1880s, there'd been issues of speeding up machinery, the two-loom controversies and so forth, people having to do twice as much work for no more money. That had led to strikes in Huddersfield in 1883 and 84, Huddersfield, Dewsbury. It led to uneasy relationships. And it led to the conflict. There were conflicts between the trade unionists and the Martin Field affair, I've already mentioned. But the big breakthrough, I suppose, in a sense, was two. One is the conflict at Mallingham Mills. I'll come back to that. And another conflict that went on between trade unions and employers in Halifax. If I just mention briefly the Halifax one before moving on to the Mallingham Mill strike. The real point of Halifax is that there was a trades council formed in 1889. It was doing quite well. But two of its leading figures, James Deaver and James Tattersall, were active members of the New Labour Union. They were victimised. So the Trades Council, what it did was to raise money so they could set them up in shops and formed a body called the Halifax Labour Union, separate from the Trades Council. So it came there, John Lister and the Trades Council led that. So really, there's quite a lot to talk about in different areas. But the Manningham Mill strike, I think, is possibly the most important. Basically, Manningham Mills, the largest mills in Bradford, 4,500 to 5,000 people it employed. 1889-90, it's working flat out because the American tariffs, the McKinley tariffs, are going to come in. So they're making, and they get profits of 8% per year, doing well. Then McKinley tariff comes in, immediately the management, Samuel Cunliffe Lister, imposes wage cuts of 17 to 33% on his workforce. That led to a few coming out, and then over 19 weeks, the whole workforce were out. It led to the denial of workers the right to meet properly. Public sites were denied them. There were riots, there was the Riot Act read, all sorts of things. Eventually they were forced back. But what Thompson says is quite right, I think, is that, in the defeat, there was so much frustration that, in fact, you got the trade union movement in Bradford, in Halifax, partly in Leeds, etc., by and large for trades councils, etc., strongly supporting the independence movement. And this is W.H. Drew led that strike. He said the working class of Bradford knew perfectly well that to a great extent the sympathies of the wealthier Bradford citizens were in the struggle with the owners. There were, of course, a few exceptions, and to these people every honour was due. Fred Jowett, later on, you have run this machine too long. We see the prejudicial results of your management: starvation, misery, crime, and the state of general abortionness, body and soul. And we mean to take the matter out of your hands and to try to make a better thing of it ourselves. But really, in a sense, you've got, epitomised that frustration that led to the formation of the ILP, that led to a proliferation of labour unions in the Charlie Glyde. Charlie Glyde was an ILPer active on the Poor Law. We have had two parties in the past. The can'ts. That's the Liberals, because they can't because of Home Rule. Home Rule must come first, and we got fed up of hearing Home Rule first and Social Reform second. And it's time that we had a party that will. And there won't, I should say, they're Conservatives. It's time that we had a party that will. And the party that will was, of course, the new Labour group. And within a month of Manningham Mills, there's a meeting at Firth's or Laycock's Temperance Hotel, and the ILP is formed. The Bradford Trades Council is run over to it very, very quickly indeed. They have to vote on Ben Tillett standing. Do we support Tillett or the Liberals? 47 of the members voted for Tillett and 33 voted for remaining supporting Illiworth. Decisions had to be made, but the Trades Council was moving in that direction. And towards the end of the century, that was reinforced because workers' municipal federations were formed in Bradford. They weren't ILP, but ILP is one on it. And they worked together to bring about the tremendous success municipally that Bradford had. And the same was occurring in Halifax, the Workers' Electoral Council and so forth. Now, there are many other things I could mention, but I think I ought to conclude because otherwise Joan is going to sort me out, I think. But the main thing is that really, in a sense, what I'm arguing is that, there's that socialist and religious framework, but really, in a sense, what's happening is there is a move towards class politics. Trade union link, anti-liberalism establishes that move. And though it may vary from area to area, because I've got a student working on Keith at the present time, the story is slightly different. It's quite clear that that is really, in a sense, the reason for this regional growth of this hotspot of the Labour Party. But I'd like to finish with two quotes. Here's one in 1906. 1906 general election. The Liberals have a chap called Claran, put forward by Illingworth. He selects who goes in. Fred Jowett wins that election, narrowly, but he wins it. So Labour in Bradford have got their first MP. And this is a poem. A plausible weaver named Claridge once sought for West Bradford in marriage, but she was left in the lurch. She would not go to church in Alfred Illingworth's carriage, which I think it just about sums it up. And then I'd like to again finish with Fred Jowett. As an old man in 1941, he wrote a pamphlet called What Made Me a Socialist. One or two of these do this. There's one or two for D.B. Foster does one for Leeds and his experiences, etc. And he reflected on his early socialist meetings. These meetings, of the Socialist League, you've seen the picture of them, were occasions for drawing together the two small groups of socialists in Leeds and Bradford, where branches of the old Socialist League had been formed. There were less than a dozen members in the Bradford branch, and I became one of them. Although weak in numbers, we were strong in faith. Sometime in the summertime, the joint forces of Leeds and Bradford socialism tramped together to spread the gospel by printed and spoken word in neighbouring villages. And at eventide, on the way home, as we walked in the country lane and on the river banks, we sang, "What is this, the sound of rumour? What is this that all men hear? Like the wind in hollow valleys when the storm is drawing near, like the rolling of the ocean and the eventide of fear. 'Tis the people marching on," and we believed they were. I rest my case.